Okay. All right. Now we should be live. There we go.
Hey, hot dog.
Oh, that took about as long as the rule took.
Like, what's happening?
All righty. It is Friday, everybody. 2 weekends before Halloween? I'm not sure how much time we have.
Spooky.
I've been, like I was saying beforehand, I've been escaping the relentless level of reading required to get through the rule with just Halloween decorations. So I've been taking out the stress by scaring all the little kids in the
There you go.
neighborhood. So,
little corn maze going on there.
if you want full-size candy bars, you're gonna have to work for it around these parts. So, all righty, let's see here. So it is Friday. It is 1 week post
1 week post rule, yeah,
arrival, which is great. Last week we had a lot of fun with the lights and the get up and everything.
And your readathon, right? I mean, 4 hours straight of just sitting there reading rules. So,
yeah, it was fun. And I spared everybody the additional streams of me reading it through the weekend. I'm still reading it. I mean, it's still a lot to process. It's like I was talking about on a post on LinkedIn this morning. It's like the actual regulatory text itself is only about 85 pages. It's less than 20% of the overall rule itself. So if you just want to know what CMMC says, it's really not that much to read. But if you want to know why it says what it says, that's what everything else in the preamble is for. Every comment response, every summary of each section, every estimate, and what their thought process was that goes into it. And so if you want like the full coherent understanding of what's going on, it's a lot of reading. If you just want to say, what's the checklist of things in the program, it's not that bad. So when we say it's a 470 page rule, that is true, but it's not a 470 page regulation. It's only about an 85 page regulation. But we're going to have a webinar on November 7th. I'll put the link in chat here in a moment. Everybody should check it out. That's where we're going to summarize everything, because 85 pages is still a lot, depending on
it's a lot. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So we're going to summarize everything, connect all the dots, visualize everything, put it on the timeline, explain what's going on, both rules, upcoming stuff, everything that you need to know. But Daniel, I think there's more awareness that we're doing a webinar on the CMMC rule than there is actual awareness of the rule itself, apparently, according to what you've got going on.
It's so funny. So Friday happens, right? And all of a sudden I'm thinking, my calls next week, everyone's going to be like, oh my gosh, it happened. Like, we're late. We got to do this. Most of my calls this week, outside of a handful, were all surprised. Like, what CMMC final rule? Like, what do you mean? What happened in the industry? The fact that the rule still has not kind of drifted their way. Now, it has only been a week and, formally, officially published on Tuesday, but still, it is shocking to me. I guess it's probably because we've obviously been paying close attention to this for a long time, but like, it's shocking to me that the layman still hasn't heard about this from their prime, giving the lead time to actually get compliant. I anticipate probably over the next 4 to 8 weeks, kind of towards the end of the year into holidays, it'll finally kind of start picking up with more awareness around what actually happened. Because again, the people I talked to this week, for the most of them, didn't even know the rule happened or what the implications were of the rule. I spent more time explaining that than anything else on the call. So it is interesting to see over the next few weeks how that narrative hopefully changes into more educated, prospects or companies that we're working with. But very interesting.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, it's it is a relatively small and niche community that would be hearing about the rule coming out if it's not the rule that shows up in contracts. And like we've talked about before, there's 2 different rules for implementing the program. There's the program rule itself that officially makes CMMC part of DoD policy, but then there's the other rule that the comment period just closed on, the 48 CFR rule, and that's the one that will revise all of the text of the contract clause 252.204.70.21, and that's what will specify your CMMC level requirement in solicitations and contracts. So that's the one that's really probably going to raise most people's awareness, but that's not going to be probably until early summer when that one is finalized. And as we know, a lot of the C3 PAO assessment organizations are booked out until early summer right now. So
which is crazy.
When the 32 CFR rule is final and the availability of CMMC assessments they're now commercially available, by the time you get through in line will be right about the time that it starts to show up in contracts. So as we've said many, many times for many different reasons, if you wait until it's in the RFP, you've waited too long.
You can be early, you can be late, but you can't be on time. And right now we've kind of missed or are very close to missing the early boat as it comes to getting ready and then it showing up in contracts. So
yeah, absolutely.
We're right there on the line.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, if anybody caught the podcast this week, they'll know the soapbox that I was on. So if you look through the other 385 pages of the rule in the preamble, you'll notice that, about 50% of the entirety of the rule, basically all of the stuff that wasn't in the proposed rule in December, is made up of public comment responses.
Yep.
DoD got 1,800 public comments, which as far as I know, is more public comments that they've received on any DoD rule ever.
That's crazy.
The 2020 CMMC rule got about 750 public comments. And the same trend showed up in this set of comments that showed up in 2020. While a lot of the comments are relevant to the rule itself, many comments are out of the scope of what the rule addresses. And that doesn't seem like a big deal when you individually submit a comment on CUI marking or international agreements or NIST requirements or things like that. But when hundreds and hundreds of people submit hundreds and hundreds of out of scope comments, what ends up happening is the government is obligated to summarize and respond in a meaningful way to all legitimate comments that come in, even if they're out of scope, as long as they're not pure spam. And so when you get hundreds and hundreds of these comments, they have to take weeks and weeks and weeks to get them all together, aggregate them all together, consider what they say, come up with a meaningful response, reminding people that this particular category of comments is not relevant. And then pretty soon it's been 6 months of them doing all this work that doesn't actually do anything inside the rule. And you'll see this when you look through the rule itself. You'll see beyond the scope of the rule, beyond the scope of the rule, not relevant to the rule, out of the scope of the rule. So we went through the entire list of every time in that, 65,000 words of DoD responses where they said this is beyond the scope of the rule. And we made a list. We deduplicated it, we shortened it, and we read it out loud on the podcast. And it takes almost 10 minutes to get through the entire list, which is very boring to listen to, but I did it to prove a point. If you're going to comment on, criticize, whatever, if you're going to talk about CMMC and what you're about to say involves something in those out of scope comments, then just know that what you're about to say is not actually a CMMC program problem. It might be related, but it is not the responsibility of the CMMC program. So people can see the podcast from this week where we sit through and talk about all of it. It's ridiculous, but you might find it somewhat informative, if not humorous.
So I listened to it on 2X, and it was almost like all those prescription pill commercials where it's like could cause bleeding from the eyes, and you listen to it at that speed, and it's really pretty
life-threatening. Ketoacidosis is not relevant to the CMMC rule. What do you know?
That's right. Who would have thought
it? All righty, let's see here. So we'll get to just to a basic question that has been coming up as more and more new people are being exposed to the world of CMMC. Microsoft is obviously a very common option that people go with, and people sometimes hear M365, they sometimes hear O365. What the heck does that mean? What's the difference? Why does it matter? What do people need to know about these two different offerings when they're thinking about their CMMC journey?
Great question. So there's a fantastic resource out there called m365maps.com. So this is an example of me pulling up the M365 E5 SKU specifically. Now, E5 refers to the commercial cloud. G5 refers to the government cloud, either GCC or GCC High. So there's some nuances there. What you see here is not always 100% feature parity with the Gov Cloud, but it's pretty freaking close at this point. So what's nice about this is it color codes everything, right? So I've got my orange column that shows me what an O365 E5 is. I've got my bluish column, my teal column, that's the AMS E5. and then I've got the Windows 10 Enterprise E5. Collectively, all three of those make up the M365 G5 license. So you can see both at an itemized SKU or product offering level, or you can see based on the bundle, right, what everything is in an EMS E5 or a Windows 10 E5 or an O365 E5, what you get as you can kind of pick those apart. The reason why this is really important to bring up is that when we do our implementations here, we leverage the Microsoft GovCloud very heavily. However, we work with a lot of enterprises that are using third-party, most of which are FedRAMP tools because they have CUI involved in them. And they want to see where the overlap is from a matching of Microsoft Gov licensing to figure out what the bare minimum is there, or maybe not just the bare minimum, but the bare minimum to be compliant, and how to integrate other third-party apps to substitute out from a cost savings. So that way you can actually be very conscientious of like, okay, I'm going to save money here, but I'm going to spend money there. The Microsoft GovCloud does a really good job of consolidating costs of security stacks and simplicity there. So long kind of term, it would probably be a good idea to look at consolidating all those efforts. There's pros and cons to that, but a big pro is the cost savings. But it also kind of shows you what you can offset or might not need to offset if you buy these certain SKUs. So highly recommend this link, m365maps.com. It is not a Microsoft website. Microsoft, if you're listening to this, please, for the love of God, make one of these and make it also with feature parity to the GovCloud. So soapbox over, highly recommend it as a resource. If you're interested, we'll drop the link here in chat as well.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a great resource for sure. Let's see. As far as some more Microsoft questions that came in before the stream happened, we had somebody message us on LinkedIn. A little desperate, actually. A little desperate. We got a message on LinkedIn. Somebody asking, can they use Windows Hello for Business on their journey towards CMMC? Because depending on which consultants that you hire, they can sometimes have very strong opinions about Windows Hello for Business. And this comes up all the time in our conversations.
Yeah. And we have a strong opinion on it, to be quite honest with you. So I actually created a PowerPoint slide that I have to share with clients and companies over and over again, why it isn't a viable solution. Now, can it be made compliant? 100%. The DoD uses Windows Hello for Business in a lot of their deployments, right? But when you're looking at scalability, this is where it gets a little tricky, right? So the very first bullet point you see here is you're going to have to disable things like credential prompts. So the user cannot be able to just sign in with their username and password on the system. They have to be able to be challenged with a multi-factor, PIN code, biometric, smart card, something like that. The way the DoD, skirts this is that a lot of times, because they have PIVs, CAT cards, things like that, users never even really know their password, right? Because everything's tied to this card, right? So they have to use a multi-factor token versus a traditional, login username and password model. The second one is the enrollment piece, right? The second bullet here is it's very hard from an ongoing supportability standpoint to actually use Windows Hello because of that, number one, disabling of the credential prompt, but you also have to enroll your IT people on those systems. They're finally releasing a version of Windows 11 that makes that a lot easier. However, it's still not fully there yet. So sort of supportability long-term of multiple different IT support staff or MSPs just makes it very difficult. And the last one is it's not platform agnostic, right? If you have Windows, fantastic. You're in great company. If you have Linux, if you have Mac, if you have, other things like that, other OS platforms, you need a tool that is more diverse in its platform, kind of agnostic, right? So we're a big duo shop when it comes to multi-factor because we have clients working with all sorts of different distros of Linux or, different OSs altogether, Windows, Mac, et cetera. So is Windows Hello, can it be made compliant? Absolutely. Is it easy to support? And does it support multiple platforms? No. So we kind of tend to lean people towards something like a Duo. We use the FedRAMP version of Duo, which is fun with the new CMMC rule, but we use the Duo version of FedRAMP to be able to check that box. So I don't know who the LinkedIn user was that posted at 12:15, but yeah, use Duo Desktop versus Windows Hello is the comment there and our general recommendation.
Gotcha. All righty, let's see here. Brad wants a annotated version of 853. Yeah,
Oh,
so do I. I would like
and
one
I
of those.
want you to read that on a LinkedIn live stream, Jacob. So, I
Be
mean,
great. That'd be great. Yeah, my heavily dog-eared and thumbed through hard copy of 853. Let me pull out my pipe and my cardigan here.
you and Ron
All
Ross
righty,
can buy
let's
a
see
nice
here.
little fireside chat there. I like that.
Let's see. I am around says, do you have any insights into section 170.12 C7 regarding certified instructors acting as consultants or assessors? What is the distinction in DoD's view that allows them to assess and not consult? We're going to have to revisit it
Yeah.
because I know that this is a hot button issue among the various certified roles in the ecosystem. Whenever the phrase, uh, serving as or working as in the capacity of and various things like that in terms of section 170.23. I haven't gotten that far in terms of reading in detail, so I don't want to give you the wrong answer, but we'll note it for next week and then get you a better answer for sure. They had a follow-up here. How would you interpret while serving as narrowly, as in not during a teaching week, or broadly, as in not for the entire period the trainer holds the certification, or something in between? We'll get back to you on both of those next week in terms of that specific question. I think everybody knows at this point, like if you fire up LinkedIn and you're looking at it, you could just throw a dart at the rule, and there is a rabbit hole of things to consider and things to think about. Just to remind everybody, the last week of each month after the CMMC Town Hall, Jason and Joy sit down on the podcast and they specifically go over questions around training, assessor certifications, things that they've seen in actual assessments, because they both sit in on assessments all the time. We are not a C3PAO, but they participate in assessments for not our clients, just to see what's going on in terms of how people are walking through assessments and stuff like that. So they're also great people to reach out to for specific training questions. All right, let's see. So somebody sent me a blog from a law firm. The law firms love writing their blogs whenever new rules come out.
Oh, they do.
And one of the blogs that they sent me says that CMMC has 4 levels. And
why would they do that, Jacob?
yeah. So at first I was like, here we go, getting ready to drop the elbow on
Can you
people.
smell what the rock is cooking?
So I messaged them, right? A responsible, cybersecurity has responsible disclosure. We try to participate in responsible public shaming. We're going to message people first before they put out incorrect information. And so I messaged the blog author. I was like, hey, what are you doing? What are you doing? And they said, well, we find that people get very confused about the fact that level 2 is split into 2 different approaches. There are self-assessments and there are external third-party assessments at level 2. And so when we explain it to people, we say there are 4 levels. There is CMMC level 1, a self-assessment, CMMC level 2, a self-assessment, CMMC level 2, an external assessment via C3PAO, and CMMC level 3, an external assessment via government DIBCAC auditors. And so they call it the 4 levels of CMMC, which anybody that's been around for a while gets immediately triggered when they hear level 4 or level 5, because the original conception of CMMC under what used to be known as 1.0 had 5 levels rather than 3 levels. So does it have 4 levels? No. However, level 2 is split into 2 different assessment approaches. So does it have 4 levels of assessments? You could say it that way. Does it have 4 levels to the model? No, it has 3 levels. But you may see occasionally people describing it this way. This is mostly a delineation of the self-assessment versus external assessment across the 3 levels of CMMC. Anybody that remembers back in the day when CMMC 2.0 was originally announced, they referred to that split at level 2 as the bifurcation of level 2. And they ditched that language. Maybe they should have kept it, because it doesn't exist anymore in the language of the rule or the regulation. But yeah, level 2 is split into 2 different assessment levels, so that sometimes causes people to say there are 4 levels to CMMC. So don't go on a witch hunt for anybody who says it. Just double check and see if that's what they mean. It's not how I would describe it, but that's where that's coming from. So, all righty. before we get into some of the live questions,
Self-assessments.
the
juicy.
question. Let's talk about the question. So speaking of self-assessments, let's talk about section 170.23 of the rule, applicability to subcontractors. Flow down, subcontractors. This is where the rubber hits the road for the majority of the DIB, because the majority of the DIB are subcontractors, right? Like, they're not prime awardees working directly with the DoD. So level 2 has a self-assessment mechanism. Level 2 also has an external assessment mechanism. So the question becomes, how will I know if I need level 2 self-assessment or level 2 C3PAO assessment, external assessment? And if we look at 170.23, the short answer is, listen, keeping it real, the short answer is you're not getting a level 2 self-assessment if you're a subcontractor. It's not going to happen. So if you only handle FCI, then you only need CMMC level 1, which is a self-assessment of the requirements in FAR 52-204-21. Very straightforward. If the subcontractor will handle CUI in the performance of the subcontract, then the absolute minimum is a level 2 self-assessment, right? Because you have to implement the requirements in 171 to protect the CUI. However, if the prime contractor handling that CUI requires an external assessment via a C3PAO, and then you get the CUI that's involved with that contract, then you need a level 2 external assessment via C3PAO. Meaning, if the prime has a requirement for a C3PAO assessment at level 2, then you have the requirement for a C3PAO assessment at level 2. It's not going to go prime C3PAO assessment and then you level 2 self-assessment.
So primes would have no ability to say, hey, Mr. Sub, you just have to self-attest to us, and that's good enough.
No, it is specific to the data flow. And we all know how good the primes are about governing their data flow. How great they are about keeping these things clean and separate, right? So if the prime on that specific contract is dealing with CUI that will allow the prime to self-assess at level 2, then when that CUI is sent to you, you can self-assess at level 2. If the CUI that they're dealing with requires C3PAO external certification level 2, then that's what is required of you as well. Which, if you're dealing with multiple primes, if you're dealing with multiple contracts at a single prime, if you're dealing with multiple different types of data flow from the prime, the odds of you having all of those things only require self-assessment above you are essentially zero. Not to mention the fact that the primes can ask you to do whatever they want, because this is a private agreement. So they may just, as we've seen in the past, require their subs to have it just to not have to worry about it.
Cost of doing business. Right.
Yeah, it's a risk mitigation thing. It's a cost of doing business thing. It's one less thing for them to deal with. So level 2 self-assessment in reality is not going to be a thing for people, because there's just too many things that could go wrong where there needs to be an external C3PAO assessment, which is going to then require it on you. And like the DoD says at the bottom, as with any solicitation or contract, the DoD may provide specific guidance pertaining to flow down. So yeah, could there be an asterisk? Could there be a caveat? Could there be an exception? Sure. Could you get a level 2 assessment? Sure. Yeah. Big if. So just so you know,
the primes aren't going to risk their supply chain and who they can use based on that asterisk.
Yeah. So just so you know, do not let yourself convince yourself that you can self-assess at level 2, because self-assessment exists in the CMMC regulation. The odds of the dice rolling in the specific way necessary for you to get away with a level 2 self-assessment are infinitesimally small.
Yeah. Well, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago. It's a contract requirement, not a company exclusion. They're not going to look at you and say, oh, Joe's Machine Shop, we're so sorry, we're going to exclude you, right? And you can do self-assessment. So again, going back and reiterating, you're not going to be able to dodge this bullet. is very, 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 very unlikely.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I mean, is it going to happen in some situations? Maybe.
Yeah.
The biggest problem that I see is not that the ability for people to get a self-assessment doesn't exist. The biggest problem is that many people hear that self-assessment is a thing, and then they immediately convince themselves, well, then we will be able to self-assess, which is not how that's going to play out. And then some of the additional details regarding level 3, if the prime needs level 3, which many will, then the minimum requirement for handling that CUI downstream from them is an external C3PAO assessment, which I'm curious to dig more into the rationale inside of the rule, because level 3 certification requirements pertain to the types of data that the DoD is extremely interested in protecting. So why would the
supply chain underneath the subcontracting
why would that,
network,
once the data flows outside of the prime needing level 3, why would you not also require level 3 there? There may be some additional detail and rationale explained in the rest of the rule that we just haven't gotten to yet, but the minimum requirement, if they require level 3 for you, is a level 2 external
certification. Yeah,
correct. If the prime is dealing with level 3 requirements, you're not going to get a level 1. If the prime has a level 3 requirement, you're not going to get a level 2 self-assessment is basically the way to read that. But we'll get into some more of the details as we read into the rule. All right, we got a bunch of questions coming in, so let's go with one of the questions that we had on a call this week, and then I'll queue up some of the ones in chat here.
fantastic.
So one of the questions that, let's see here. So one of the questions that comes up on calls all the time, and this is related to people's incident response obligations under DFARS 7012, is the cost of storing data. And as you are very quick to remind people, and as we've seen a lot of people are not aware of, it costs money to store information, and there are some cost considerations that they should think about based off of when and how you need to get access to that data. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So when we're looking at kind of storing these like logs, right? So Microsoft Sentinel is a SIM tool. It uses Azure Log Analytics and blob storage, kind of long-term storage capabilities for storing those logs. There are different tiers that charge you different amounts of money, right? So a hot tier is going to be able to read and write and that data very quickly, and it's going to be pretty expensive, usually one of your more expensive tiers. Then you have cool storage, which is a little bit cheaper, but that's assuming you're not reading that data very often, right? So it's long-term storage, kind of stuck out there. So maybe you do hot for 3 months worth of data, and then you do kind of cool for 6 months worth of data. And then an even cheaper option all the way down the line is something called archive storage. So when you're looking at archive, that's stuff that you're very rarely ever going to have to read, only kind of a worst case scenario. And it's super cheap to store data, but it's very expensive to read that data. And so when you're looking at all these different tiers from a pricing perspective, make sure that whether you're doing like managed disk, long-term storage of like SFTP data or other things, or log data, make sure that you're going to build a strategy around when you're going to move that from a hot tier down to a cool tier, down to an archive tier, because you could save not only hundreds of dollars, but thousands and thousands of dollars over the duration of you guys keeping that information. So it's very important from a strategy perspective and a cost savings measure to kind of dive into that and figure out what that balance is for you. It might not be 3 months of hot, it might be 4 months, might be 5 months, but start kind of building that out, because you can then reallocate those funds to do more fun things in your IT and cyber budget.
You can't spell funds without fund, am I right?
You can't spell funds without fun. That's right.
Yeah, that's a really great consideration, because your data storage obligations, if you're in an incident response situation, the DoD, you internally or the DoD wants access to that information and it's locked away in cold storage, it can be pretty expensive in the middle of a crisis to have to suddenly try to retrieve that information. So that's really, really, really good to know. All right, let's see here. As far as some comments go, pull some up here. Let's see. So Brad said, what does the volume of out-of-scope comments say about how the program has been handled overall? Brad, I know where you're going with this, buddy. I'm happy that you're here every week. I know exactly what you mean. See you on the town hall too. I know that you don't agree with the way that the DoD has handled explaining the program, but I'll just go ahead and tell you this, right? The way that rulemaking is typically explained is the opposite of what DoD has done over the years. A good example of how rulemaking is typically done and communicated to the people that are affected by it is what is currently going on with DHS cybersecurity rulemaking under the CERCIA rule, which will have obligations on the DIB for incident reporting requirements above and beyond what currently exists in DFARS 7012 in current contracts, or the Department of Education rule that's getting ready to come out that will expand the obligations of applying NIST SP 800 171 requirements to higher education institutions. The only time that people will hear about those rules is when they are published in the Federal Register. And the only time that people will hear responses from the government regarding those rules is when the final rules are published with responses to those public comments, webinars, conference appearances, any web page updates, any additional guidance, any FAQ guidance. I know that this all feels very sporadic and very disjointed and not very good. It is an infinitely larger amount of things that they are not technically obligated to do by the book when they're explaining the program. So part of it is there could always be more that they could do to explain what's going on, but we got to have a little bit of perspective here in terms of the volume and amount of stuff that the DoD has been putting out around the program. They have very consistently said over the years, right, that this is not the requirements in DFARS 7012, and that this is not the DoD CUI program, that this is not the NARA CUI program, and on and on and on, this whole list of things for out of scope comments. The last point to consider here is that when rulemaking is actually ongoing, they're not allowed to talk about it, which is why over the last 2 years, you haven't really heard any official statements regarding CMMC directly whenever the DoD does go to these industry events. That's why Stacy Bosjanek would always say, we're doing these other things to help you with CMMC, but I can't talk about what's actually going on in CMMC during this venue because of the ongoing public comment process. So part of it is their hands are tied by the nature of the rulemaking system, by the rules of rulemaking. And then beyond that, they've gone way above and beyond what some of the other agencies have done. So just something to consider, because I know that this is a common topic that gets brought up. They could always be better, but just think about what the scenario would be if they did it the way that the other agencies do it.
I was just about to say, could you imagine, like, oh, by the way, surprise, we have this new third-party certification requirement of your cybersecurity, requirements, right? It's like, oh my God, this came out of left field. At least, again, for the people who've been paying attention, this is just 5 years in the making, 4 years in the making, right, of this actually coming to fruition. And so I couldn't imagine if they did something like what the Department of Education is doing right now. And then all of a sudden, universities make sure to go check the boxes on 171, right, if you want financial aid information. So absolutely. All right, let's see here. Okay, Clint says for level 2, do security protection assets, security protection data assets still need to meet all practices, or do they now only need to meet practices that are relevant to the capabilities provided, as mentioned in Final Rule Table 3? Based off my reading, based off of the conversations that I've seen so far, it is only applicable practices. It's only applicable practice, which technically is the way that it should have always worked, right? You don't have certain requirements. The perfect example here, right, is Wi-Fi requirements in 800.171. If you don't have Wi-Fi in an environment, you don't have to then go out and establish a Wi-Fi capability because there is a requirement in 800.171 to secure Wi-Fi, right? It is not applicable because the basis is not there. So there is a certain level of applicability to requirements that has always been there, but there's more clarification in the rule now that you're only assessing certain assets against applicable practices rather than against all practices, which wasn't worded well in the proposed rule. That's my reading of it so far. Have you seen the same thing, Daniel? So that's what's interesting. So Ned had a comment very similar to this. And so I actually pulled up the scoping guidance for CMMC level 2. And so if you look under OSA requirements, organizations seeking assessments, I'm going to scroll down here a little bit so you guys can see this. It says prepare to be assessed against CMMC L2 security requirements. However, under the CMMC assessment requirements column here, it says assess only against requirements that are relevant to the capabilities provided. So does the organization seeking assessment need to apply all controls but only be assessed against the relevant ones? So it does read a little confusing, right? And so from what I've seen on LinkedIn, I need to do a little bit of a deeper dive. I am seeing something very similar to you, Jacob, where you're going to implement the relevant controls to those systems. Now, who deems them as relevant is a fun, rabbit hole to go down as well, because there is no clear guidance or stance around relevant around every type of different asset that you could be providing there. But at the end of the day, you're only going to be assessed against the ones that are contributing to that security protection of those CUI assets. So it is worded a little weird in the sense of it looks like, oh, I've got to apply all controls here because it's the same verbiage under CUI assets too. So hopefully I can dive in and get a little bit more clarity around that. Jacob, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's another one that we just got to double check against the guidance. So as people probably know, the rule itself has been published, as well as the CMMC model documentation. So the scoping guide, the assessment guide for all the various levels, as well as an updated CMMC FAQ. So there are multiple places to double check your thinking and the wording in the rule. So we'll have to add that one to the list to get the actual answer. The answer ought to be, regardless of what the asset type is, that you assess against the applicable requirements and practices. For instance, one that comes up pretty often is, or at least it used to come up in the past, separation of duties, right? The rationale for whether a control is applicable or not is whether the basis for a control exists or not, right? And that is to say that the applicability of a control is not based off of your ability to afford the control or understand the technology required for any given control. It's whether the basis for that control, for that safeguard, exists or not. Wi-Fi being one example. Another example being separation of duties. There was an early interpretation that I hope has gone away, where people would say, well, the requirement says we have to be able to separate duties, but we only have one person. So we need to hire a person in order to meet this requirement. That is not what that means, right? The basis for separating the duties does not exist. It doesn't mean you need to hire enough people in order to have the basis, just like you don't have to buy Wi-Fi stuff in order to have the basis to secure it if it never existed in the first place. So that's the way that it ought to be done. That's the way that it ought to play out. Certain wording, like we were talking about earlier, the arbitrage between different FAQs and different guidance, things like that. Those are just the things that we're all going to have to try to understand collectively as we move forward. And, you should definitely follow people like Amir Armand, Fernando Machado, Vince on LinkedIn from the C3PO perspective, because they do a really good job of putting out clarifying guidance of how they're interpreting what's going on. So definitely ping them and check their posts, follow them as well, because there's just a million different things to talk about in the rule. All righty, let's see here. Somebody was talking about holding evidence for 6 years. So I'm not familiar with the BOP acronym. I don't know if this was body of evidence, but yes. So as people may have saw on LinkedIn that I posted about it, if you scroll through about 157-ish pages, you'll come across the explanation for why you have to maintain evidence artifacts used in your assessment to make a determination that controls are implemented or not for 6 years. That was actually input from the Department of Justice. There were comment recommendations. DoD's preference was to only require people to maintain assessment artifacts for 1 year, maybe 3 years, because that's the total amount of time that your certification is valid for. That would make sense. Department of Justice came in and said, why don't we extend that a little bit to be 6 years? So is this a nefarious suggestion because they're out here hunting for people that are making false claims? Maybe not. Maybe it's just part of the standard fare and they want to keep everything on the same page because this is the common requirement for retaining information in all sorts of different regulations. But just so you know, CMMC is a DoD regulation, but it is not just the DoD who has an interest in it. Folks like the Department of Justice have a very specific interest in what's going on. So just be aware, this is not some, thing that just got concocted at random. There's actually a significant amount of coordination and commenting that happens among the agencies long before a rule is published for public comment. And so there's a whole back and forth of concurrence, non-concurrence. We want this. You should change this. Just like there's a public comment process, there's an interagency comment process that happens before the rule comes out. Something also to note whenever people are submitting comments demanding changes in the rule, there's a lot of inertia that goes into the language of a rule before the rest of us get to comment on it. So something to keep in mind. But I was happy that they included that line in there. That was a suspicion, a theory that had been floating around for a long time, that this was eerily similar to what DOJ typically wants. And here they actually said, oh yeah, you got to talk to those guys about why you have to maintain
why they want it
for 6 years. All righty, let's see here.
What other ones we got in here?
Somebody was talking about, we find most self-assessments are done wrong due to one's understanding of the rules. Yeah, I would say that we've seen that play out from evidence from DIBCAC, when they are out there giving their updates. When DIBCAC shows up to verify perfect scores in SPRS that are uploaded via self-assessment, typically those scores tumble by an average of 100 points sometimes into the negative territory of scoring when an external provider actually shows up to assess people according to 800-171A. Probably the main reason why those self-assessments are done wrong, quote unquote, is because people don't understand 171A or how to really use it. We talked about last week, there is a tool on the DIBCAC website. If you want a free tool, it's a little clunky.
It's an access database. So
it's an access database. It's not ideal. It's the 88 Oldsmobile Royale, but it still runs. It still runs. It's the Oldsmobile of the assessment tools out there. But if you need to get the job done, if you want to calculate the score correctly, that is a free tool that is available that DoD actually uses during their assessments that they maintain. So that's something to consider. And like, as Nancy said, that's the whole reason why CMMC exists, is because self-assessments are not a reliable mechanism for giving the DoD assurance that their requirements are being met. All right, let's see here. We talked about hot storage and cold storage. Something that's been coming up recently in some.
We got a little comment up there, by the way, from Nancy Curtis.
Oh yeah, let's see here.
It's on the screen. Well, it was on the screen. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so something that's been coming up in our calls. You can't talk about technology solutions these days unless you're talking about licensing.
Yep.
And that's probably the thing we talk about the most. And you have a concept that you use on calls that I love, where you talk about minimum viable licensing.
Correct.
So you want to maybe just explain this concept to people? It's part of the reason why we ask so many questions about the people that want to do business with us, because there's a lot of issues that can come up if they zig instead of zag on their licensing.
Yeah, so CMMC is already very expensive, right? The Microsoft GovCloud, expensive. Other third-party vendors, very expensive. So what we need to understand is what's the minimal viable licensing to get you into compliance so that we can maximize those tool sets. Not only minimal viable maybe from a specific provider, but what can we offset if at all possible? And so whenever I'm doing discovery calls with people, we'll kind of walk through that minimal viable language to understand what tools do they have existing, what tools do they need to use from a productivity suite perspective, what tools are they going to need for both compliance and security. And that differs, honestly, across different enterprises, right? Or different small businesses, right? Most people now at a minimum have a spam filter, right? So people are going to want to keep that, or we're going to switch it to the Microsoft and maybe save some money, right? Some people need to switch because they're not using FedRAMP tools that process, store, and transmit CUI, right? So, that's a problem too, that, okay, I'm not using a FedRAMP spam filter and that has CUI, process, store, or transmit through it. I need to get to a FedRAMP version. So now we have to kind of do, okay, what's minimal viable to get you to that? Either upgrade your existing tool to a FedRAMP solution or sub out for like a Microsoft product, right? And so one of the things that we like to do is make sure that not only are we right sizing so that you can pass an assessment from a technical controls perspective, but also right sizing so you're not overspending money for services you probably are not either going to need to use or maybe just not need to use yet, and can be an upgrade, later on in the upcoming months or upcoming years as those things, present themselves.
Yeah. I'll go ahead and leave this banner on here for it's a great explanation. maybe we can just re-emphasize this point, and I'm getting to a comment that was submitted last week, but maybe we can just re-emphasize this point. I think people would be very surprised at the amount of time that we spend on calls explaining things to people in such a way so that they aren't spending more money than they need to. I mean, it is a significant portion of our conversations with people who are trying to give us money, where we are trying to make sure that they aren't giving us too much of their money. I mean, I don't know if you want to maybe talk about how often this comes up, because
it comes up all the time, especially on the other side, right? So Microsoft licensing, at least in the GovCloud, is an annual subscription. So getting that right on the front end, you're paying a large sum of money on the front end for Gov High licenses. One thing that's more fluid and consumption-based is something called Azure. And so the Azure government subscription, that's going to vary month to month based on how much data you're using. Well, there's things called Azure Cost Management and other things you can do on a monthly basis to look at reducing costs, resizing virtual machines, resizing disk, deploying or not deploying certain resources, right? Reconfiguring of certain things. And so that's where we step in very consistently. We have solutions architects. That's basically all that they do some days, where we're looking at Azure invoices and we're making sure that we're right sizing based on what they actually need. So they're not spending thousands of dollars a month on services that they just don't even need. That sometimes, and I hate to say this, sometimes the clients don't even know those services have been running in their environment.
Yeah.
And so we come in and do a little bit of a cleanup work to help them save some money, because compliance is already expensive. Right. Why make it more expensive, right? Yeah. And so we want to make sure to reel that in as a cost-saving measures for our clients.
Yeah, absolutely. And this leads to a point for a comment that was submitted. I believe it was just on the YouTube channel that was slightly critical of Summit 7 and saying that we were sort of in an ivory tower, that we were hobnobbing with our top hats with the intelligentsia of the CMMC world, that we're rubbing elbows with DoD at events that normal people don't have access to, and that we are out of touch with the DIB everyman, and that we don't we don't know what's going on with small businesses. Personally, the reason that we go to those events, the reason that we're talking about these overly priced, beltway centric, out of touch events, is because normal people can't go to them. That's why we have 75 hours of podcasts that have come out every week for the last 2 years. That's why we do CS2 events. Once we ran out of in-person seats at CS2 events, that's why we added a virtual option to attend CS2 events. And after CS2 events are over, if you didn't pay to attend them, that's why we put the talks on YouTube. It's why we post on LinkedIn now multiple times a day, let alone just multiple times a week, to democratize this information and put it out for free. But the real question comes down to, Daniel, do we only work with enterprise clients? Do we only work with 10,000 employee plus?
I was just about to say, like, in the past 24 hours, one of these was this morning, I've talked to a 3-person company and a 3,000-person company, like, in 24 hours. And that's not uncommon for me. Like, I understand small businesses, their biggest hurdle is cost. They can control data flow a lot easier. Enterprises usually have the money, but don't have an understanding of the data flow and the boundary, right? And so you deal with two very separate problems there. And I want to go back to a point that you just said, Jacob. Like, one of the reasons we're attending all these events, these closed door DoD events, which we actually don't attend probably as many as people think we do, is to actually advocate. Because guess what primes are not really doing on your behalf, at least from what I've heard. They're not doing a good job of advocating for you. They're doing a good job of CYAing themselves, making sure they're protected, but they're not speaking for their supply chain. They're not speaking for the small business that has, 4, 5, 6 employees that they want to make sure that they can write a paycheck the next pay period, right? That's who they're not, talking to and addressing. And Jacob goes into these rooms, Scott Edwards goes into these rooms, Amy Edwards goes into these rooms, and they actively advocate to make sure that some small voice is heard as it relates to small business. Because when I started at Summit 7, I think there were maybe 30 active employees at the time. Like, most of my career's been in small business, and I love it. And even Summit 7 still is a small business. We only have a couple hundred employees. And so anyways, I have a very small spot for that. And I hate that people think that we're like that, but believe me, we are not.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, that's why now we're doing a weekly Q&A. We're doing the podcast. We're doing all this stuff. We're putting out all this content. So tell your friends if they haven't found it. We put it all out for free. So let's see here. So here's a question for Brett. How could a prime receiving CUI limit data shared with a subcontractor to FCI? Well, limiting it from CUI to FCI would be a situation where you're not getting the CUI.
Yeah.
The only way to limit it down to a level 1 requirement is if you just don't get the CUI. And this is a problem, for instance.
It's kind of a decontrolling potentially all the way to that degree, right?
Right. So, this isn't sort of like removing elements of the CUI data such that it loses its CUI-ness in this like philosophical determination of when something no longer is CUI. Going from CUI to FCI is you just don't have CUI at all. Yeah. So that would be the only way that they'd be able to limit the data shared. As we were talking about earlier, primes are big organizations, but prime programs are not as big and well-resourced, I think, as a lot of people would imagine. Yeah. Because primes have to win awards just like everybody else does, and they typically cut corners on their bids just like everybody else does.
Yep.
Now, the large primes tend to leverage their position and maybe underestimate what's going on or what might be necessary because it's very easy for them to get contract mods. That's just the way the business works when you're got a mega prime contractor bidding on $1 billion satellite ground control system or something like that. They might know that they don't have all the bodies that they need, which when it comes around to the time for the program to actually execute, they don't have enough people, they don't have enough time, they don't have enough money to do what they're doing, let alone carefully dissect the data flows that might be going downstream into the supply chain, especially because supply chain and those prime programs are different divisions entirely. So the idea of them limiting the flow of CUI down to you is pretty far-fetched, I think, in terms of practical terms. Yeah. And the idea now, based off what the rule says, that if the prime requires CMMC level 2 and then you're getting data under that same contract, you require CMMC level 2 external certification. There's just a lot of stuff that's preventing the ability for this to be a realistic approach. The important thing to remember here is that, as they emphasize in the rule multiple times, your interactions between you as a subcontractor and your prime are between you and the private
contract.
They are not the domain of the government to interfere in how that works. So just so you know, it's why it is so important to have a very solid and careful conversation with your customer, because a lot of the conversations that people want to have with DoD need to be had with the primes.
Yep.
And their answers, their rationale, their plans, their risk acceptance, their rollout ideas for what they're going to do are up to them. So it's actually kind of nice that the rule is out at this point, because we can start to shift that focus. People need to be asking the same questions about what's going on that they sent to the DoD. They really need to be asking that to the primes. So.
Yep, absolutely.
All righty, let's see here.
We got time for one or two more here.
Yeah, let's see. So Craig always has awesome questions in here. All right, so Craig asks, what would be your plain language interpretation or takeaway from this bit of the 32 CFR rule? It should be noted the department may include CMMC requirements on contracts awarded prior to 48 CFR Part 204 CMMC acquisition rule becoming effective, but doing so will require bilateral contract modification after negotiations. My way of reading that is, if DoD were sufficiently motivated to be, they are really concerned about a particular situation with a particular contractor and particular types of data, they can negotiate with those contractors to say, we're going to come assess you now. I don't think this is going to affect 99% of people. This is going to be a very, very narrow and targeted situation. Those people probably already know who they are. They're probably already funded sufficiently, but the DoD can modify a contract for all kinds of reasons. Modifications require negotiation, and there's all sorts of stuff that goes into place. This is part of the reason why the DoD has said all along that the CMMC rule isn't going to retroactively modify existing contracts. There's just too much involved with what's going on, but they could modify a contract for this or for any other reason if they really wanted to get, dedicate their resources and time to having that conversation with those contractors. But this is not going to affect, this isn't going to affect people probably watching this stream.
So here's a question for you, Jacob, that I was just thinking about. CMMC comes out, right? 7021 is there. People go get their third-party certification. However, they have CUI outside of that CMMC boundary that they're still attesting to a different SPUR score. Mm-hmm. Is there a world where they can have a SPUR score, for old CUI, pre-7021, pre-CMMC, and a separate SPUR score? I guess in this case, it would be probably deemed an enclave at that point for a CMMC certification boundary, because maybe they haven't implemented all 110 on their legacy CUI, I'll call it, DFARS 7012 requirements. Any thoughts on that?
The first two things that come to my mind are there would probably be some creative ways that people could leverage the cage code system and the DoD UID system identification numbering system in CMMC to carve out legacy systems with certain scores and new systems with certain scores. This is the thing, right? Is there's a lot of, like we were talking about, there's some spots in the rule where there's some space between how they explain it in one spot and they explain it in another. There's certain things in the FAQs that leave a little bit of space between the FAQ explanation and the explanation in the rules. Even between the two different FAQs, just so everybody knows, there is a CMMC FAQ, which is maintained by the CMMC PMO, and there is the DoD Procurement Toolbox Cybersecurity FAQ, which is managed by OSD ANS. Yes, there are two different FAQs managed by two different teams regarding the same thing. That is very annoying if you want a clear-cut, exact, precise, evergreen answer from the government, because you're probably never going to get that about anything. It is advantageous because you can leverage the arbitrage between these various answers in order to engineer something that is useful for you. Now, I'm not saying that this is like a malicious compliance thing where we're like, whoa, yeah, we're doing that, sure. As much as there's a lot of material here to take advantage of in order to craft the narrowest scope possible, to craft the sequence of assessment for the specific enclaves that you want, for all sorts of things. But it's a double-edged sword because all that extra rope is enough to hang yourself with too. But I think, as demonstrated by the comment responses in the rule, if you ask the government for answers, you're going to get government answers to things. Right. So it's just going to take probably working with people or a lot of reading and understanding on your own to take advantage of the space in between answers that they've given us here. All right. So Corinne asks, do you think the concept of contractor risk managed assets goes against the concept of covered systems and spaces? Does the CRMA create a tremendous gray area and negate the security intended by 800-171, which has its foundation in a security boundary? Yes, I do. Yes, I do agree with this. I think that CRMA is a joke. I think it's a complete waste. I think it's a ridiculous concept that should never have been included in it whatsoever. I think that anybody who knows, here we go, as a callback to these closed door meetings that happened, I'm not going to name names, right? I'm not going to name names. It's a fun
story.
But I'll just say that the powers that be in the industrial base are the mega primes, and they have a lot of influence on the way that programs like CMMC walk and talk when they finally become regulations. And we randomly got this concept of CRMA one day, and it is thanks to the primes not wanting to play by the rules as they were written in 800-171. So they created a category of assets that made things easier for them. And as a result, we now all have to deal with this thing over here where we're like, how do we think about it? What applies to it? Doesn't the idea of having assets on the same network, in the same segment, in the same space, right next to assets handling the CUI mean that those things should definitely be in scope? Absolutely. Unless you're a gajillion dollar defense corporation and you don't want to, then you can write the rules in such a way that you can leverage this gray space to make things easier on you. So yes, I hate CRMA. I think it's ridiculous, but it's in the rule. technically, because of the way that CRMA is written, it can make things easier on people if they want to take advantage of it, but it's another thing to explain.
Yep.
It's another acronym that you have to go over, and it can be abused in certain ways to really undermine the goal of 800-171. And I think that the origins of the CRMA concept just go to show that, sometimes that's just the way that things play out. Maybe it can be removed in the future under 3.0. Maybe it can be revised in the future under 3.0. I don't like it. People can take advantage of it in different ways, but yeah, I don't like it.
I don't either. And I know very few people using it, by the way. Like in all the conversations I've had, they're like, it's too risky because an assessor can come, if deemed, and spot check, right? And people don't want to open up a risky door on assessor may or may not need to, more deeply assess this asset based on my lack of documentation or security policy or something like that. So
yeah, absolutely. All right, everybody. Well, that's the end of the show. We're right in an hour. Just to close out here from Brad. Brad said, "Good job. I gadfly these things. Appreciate all the work." Listen, Brad, I love it, man. I love the energy. I love the consistency. I see you all over the place. You ask good questions. You bring up good, valid points. So we're not negating or undermining.
No, we love it.
Points whatsoever. It's conversations like that make the ecosystem vibrant and make doing the compliance actually kind of entertaining, because there's not really that vibrancy in the SOC world or the ISO 27001 world. There's a lot of policy implications that go on here. There's a lot of big picture things that matter. That's what makes the whole thing go around. So we appreciate it. We love it. We hope you see you next week too. We hope to see everybody next week. If you asked a question in chat and we didn't get to it, we will add it to the queue for the beginning of next week. There's a lot of stuff in the rule. We're all still reading through it. If you find this recording afterwards and you have some questions, you can leave it in the comments below. You can DM it to us. You can leave it in a YouTube video comment, or you can save it for next week, and then we will get to it as best as we can. And we'll link to our Pathfinder tool. If you're finding this and you go, what the heck is going on? Right. There's a million different questions and you don't know where to start. Check out the Pathfinder tool on our website. It's free. It's free, Brad. It's free. It's free.
And it's not an access database, by the way.
It's not an access database. It is free, and it will give you a very solid idea of where you need to start on your CMMC journey. That's it. That's an hour. We'll see you guys next week. Happy Halloween.
Enjoy your weekend. See y'all.